Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Just Ask, where if you have a question, just ask. Today we have a question from Lee Cass Frost, and he asks about content. How do you decide on the type of content that is worth producing? If the content is good, is it worth pouring countless hours into without adequate results? When should you prioritize content that has a wider appeal versus what you enjoy? Super big question. I think the first thing you need to start thinking about is what is your goal? You might be making content without a goal, and then content kind of goes everywhere and you can't stay focused. For example, when I was creating the League of Legends Anonymous podcast, the Lolo podcast, my goal was to create community. And eventually, pretty quickly, I found community and I was getting a lot of value out of doing the Lolo podcast for me, right? And then eventually, my goal ended up changing where I'm like, hey, I need to do projects that are going to get me into esports and help me get hired in esports full time. So when that happened, I suddenly realized, hey, the Lolo podcast isn't helping me achieve that goal, at least in the timeline that I want. And therefore, I had to cut it, right? Out of the stuff that I was doing. So really focusing on your goal is going to help you decide on what content is worth putting tons of hours into, right? Because you need at least some value back, whether it's something really, really intentional or it's something really simple like I just want to learn how to edit. Okay, for example, as a video editor, you might be like, I'm trying to get a full-time job in esports doing video editing, but maybe you don't have the experience and the reps to do that. So your goal might be like, hey, I just need to get a ton of experience, right? So suddenly when you're doing free work, that might not be super important with your content because your goal is to get reps and you just want to get as many reps as possible. And for some reason, the money is not as important in that goal, into achieving that goal, right? But the long-term goal might be to get a job in esports, if that made any sense. Another thing I would consider, especially when it comes to prioritizing the content you want to make or figuring out what content is worth producing, there's an exercise, I can't remember what it's called, but pretty much you put up all your ideas that you've brainstormed onto kind of a graph where one axis is how easy it is to make, and then also how impactful you think that content will be, right? So what happens is that you want to start working on the content that is the easiest to produce, that will have the most impact, and you start cutting the projects that might have the lowest impact and are the hardest to produce. For example, for me, one thing I really want to do is I documented 3 years of my esports journey, and I want to combine that from hours of content into a video or 2 or 3. But the thing is, I think that's going to have very little impact on my audience and what I'm trying to do on YouTube. And it's going to be a ton of work. I have to scrub through hundreds of hours of content and then find the storyline and then edit around all the ums and the crappy speech patterns that I have. Versus something like this, which is a piece of content where you guys field me questions, so I don't have to do as much research and figuring out what you guys want. And I'm creating a ton of impact because I'm answering directly your questions that you have to bring you value. And then if all things go well, I just set up a camera, hit record, edit very minimally, and then upload that. So that is something where that's how I decided to do this piece of content where it's very easy to do. Supposedly easy. This is my 5th take. And then it has the most impact, right? So that's one thing when you have a lot of ideas and trying to figure out what content is worth producing. The other part of that is I think you really need to know who is your audience, because that's going to also help figure out what your greatest impact could be. Again, if this aligns with your goals, right? Another thing that I want to answer is if the content is good, is it worth putting tons of hours into? We've all been there where we feel like we're shouting to the internet and no one is listening, right? And it's really, really tricky because it could be something that we're really, really passionate about and something that we want to do, but then we're trying to figure out, should we make what we want to do versus should we make it for a wider appeal? And again, it comes back to what is your goal, and is that the right goal for you? And is that the right goal at this time for you? When you're really trying to figure out if your content is good, I think you need to be really self-aware and look at your work critically. And it's hard for people that have made that content to really look at your content through that lens. So find someone that you trust to give you the feedback and understand what kind of feedback you want from that person, right? I can ask my mom, like, what do you think about this? And she'd be like, oh, you're so handsome and I love you and you're great. You're my son, right? And that might not be the feedback that I need. That's probably not the feedback you need when it talks about like, is this content actually good? Does this hit the esports audience? Is this interesting to people that I'm trying to reach? Which probably is not my mom. So find someone. Find peers in esports, find peers in gaming, find your friends that you trust. So you really need to audit like your content, seeing like what is actually good. And then from there, you really stack it up to like what your goals are to really figure out like, is this worth doing? Because it might just require some luck. It might require just you to be a better marketer of your content. And that's super real, right? If you're posting great videos on YouTube, how are people going to find it? Especially if you're in something that's very, very saturated like League of Legends. If you're making highlight reels that are amazing, but you don't have the right titles, you have a horrible thumbnail, and like you got to make sure how are you going to get this in front of people to actually look at and criticize and to like love and like and subscribe. So I think another part of it is like, let's say for you, Frost, I don't know what specifically you're talking about, but let's say you're talking about the podcast. In esports, podcasts are kind of like starting to catch up and grow. But when we talk about the podcast medium, one, there's not an easy way to find new podcasts. It's really, really hard. And two, there's still a lot of people that don't know what podcasts are or find value in podcasts. So how are you going to get over that hurdle and figure out, hey, this is how you find my podcast, right? For example, when I was doing work for Travis Gafford with Hotline League, his podcast, the way I got noticed and hired by him is like I started making video cuts of parts of his podcast. But I also knew that like people on Twitter are not unmuting videos. So and the podcast is very heavily based off of audio. How am I going to make something interesting that's visually appealing? So I started doing some animations around text and putting some meme stuff and like flash and graphics effects and zooms and all this kind of stuff to like catch people's attention. And I caught Travis's attention and I caught like the Twitter sphere's attention with that stuff. So if you really have good content, then you got to figure out how do I get in front of people? And that's why like advertisers use advertising dollars to get their stuff in front of people's eyes, right? So I think that pretty much answers all three of your questions. Again, I want to just like emphasize on the last one, what you enjoy versus what's the wider appeal. I think that really depends on your goal. Like, is it really worth your happiness and the hours and the sacrifices you're making because you're creating content that's creating traction, gaining traction when you eventually burn out? I mean, look at streamers, right? Streamers stream to like one or two people and sometimes a lot of bots, and they don't gain the traction that they're looking for because maybe they're just doing something they want to do, which is like just stream their league games and not have a webcam and not even talk to their audience, right? Like that might be what they want to do, and if that's the case, like they need to have something really, really special to grab an audience. And is that really worth the time that they're putting in to their stream because they're doing what they want? Versus you see a lot of streamers that play games that they got traction with and they hate the game now, but they keep doing it because they need the views and they want the views and they want the Twitch Prime subs, they want the monetization and all that kind of stuff. Like, is that really worth it? Like, see where that lines up with your goals and like your happiness and your satisfaction. I think that's really important. Hope that answered your question. I know it was a very broad question. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions, whether you're Frost or anyone else, and we can dive into those more on the next episode if you like to. Thanks for watching. My name is Sam, aka Just Casual. See you guys next time.